The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled down the gravel drive, and I stood there on the porch of the Anderson Ranch with my hands shaking so hard I had to grip the wooden railing to steady myself. Behind me, Richard's brother stood with his arms crossed, his face twisted in that same smug expression I'd seen on my husband's face 1,000 times before. The lawyer next to him kept adjusting his tie like he was uncomfortable, and he should be. They'd driven all the way from Dallas with papers that claimed this land, my family's land, belonged to them now. The August heat pressed down on all of us like a physical weight, and I could smell the drought-dry grass and the distant scent of cattle. My throat felt like sandpaper, but when I finally spoke, my voice came out clear and strong. No. Just that one word, but it carried 64 years of my life in it, and I watched the color drain from their faces. 3 months earlier, I would have signed anything they put in front of me just to avoid conflict, just to keep the peace. But that woman died the day I found the hotel receipt, and the woman standing here now had learned exactly what she was capable of. 3 months earlier, life had settled into the kind of comfortable rhythm that makes you forget to pay attention. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of Texas hill country just outside Austin, with its weathered barn and the main house that had belonged to my grandfather. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of mockingbirds and the distant lowing of cattle, and I'd make coffee in the kitchen where 3 generations of Anderson women had made breakfast. The countertops still bore the faint stains from my mother's blackberry preserves, and the old wooden table where I sat had witnessed countless family meals, heated discussions, and quiet moments of reflection. Richard had been spending more time in Dallas, but that seemed normal enough. He'd always handled the business side of things, the contracts and the sales, while I managed the day-to-day operations. We'd been married 42 years, and I trusted him the way you trust the ground under your feet. You don't question it until it gives way. The ranch itself was my sanctuary. I knew every fence post, every gully where water collected after rain, every mesquite tree that provided shade for the cattle on scorching summer days. My daily routine had a meditative quality to it. Feeding the horses at dawn, checking the water troughs, walking the property line to ensure everything was secure. The physical work kept me grounded, gave me purpose. I'd inherited my grandfather's love for this land, and sometimes when I stood on the hill overlooking the main pasture, I could almost feel him standing beside me, his calloused hand on my shoulder, telling me stories about the Depression and how he'd nearly lost everything before stubbornly refusing to give up. The first crack appeared at our 4th of July barbecue. I'd invited half the county, the way we always did, and the yard was full of folding tables and the smell of mesquite smoke. I'd spent 3 days preparing, making my famous potato salad, marinating brisket, ensuring we had enough cold beer and sweet tea for everyone. The party was one of those traditions that defined our place in the community, a gathering where neighbors caught up on gossip, kids ran wild in the fields, and the bonds of rural life were reinforced through shared food and laughter. Linda Martinez, my closest friend since high school, cornered me by the potato salad and lowered her voice. "Maggie, honey, I don't want to stir up trouble, but my nephew works at that hotel on 6th Street in Dallas, and he mentioned seeing Richard there pretty regular." The words hit me like cold water, but I smiled and brushed it off. Richard had clients in Dallas, he had meetings. Of course he stayed in hotels. But Linda's eyes held something I couldn't quite read, a mixture of pity and concern that made my stomach clench. She squeezed my hand, and I could see she wanted to say more, but we were interrupted by someone asking about the brisket. The moment passed, but that feeling, that cold knot of dread, didn't. I carried that feeling around for the next week like a stone in my pocket, pulling it out and examining it when I was alone. "I know you're sitting there thinking I should have confronted him right then, demanded answers, refused to let it slide. But you have to understand something about the kind of woman I was raised to be. My mother taught me that a wife's job was to support her husband, to keep the home fires burning, to smooth over rough patches with patience and grace. I'd watched her defer to my father on every major decision, seen her swallow her opinions to keep peace at the dinner table, observed her transform into a smaller, quieter version of herself over the years. It was the template I'd been given for marriage, and I'd followed it faithfully. 42 years of marriage had reinforced that lesson until it was as much a part of me as my own bones. So I waited. I watched. And I told myself that Linda must have been mistaken, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, that Richard would never betray me because we'd built this life together, and that had to mean something. But once that seed of doubt was planted, it grew roots. I started noticing things I'd previously overlooked. The way Richard's phone was always face down on surfaces. How he'd started taking calls in his truck rather than in the house. The faint scent of perfume on his shirt sometimes. A floral fragrance I'd never worn. The way he'd become distant during our evening conversations, his mind clearly elsewhere even as he nodded and made appropriate sounds. These observations accumulated like drops of water filling a bucket, and I found myself analyzing our interactions with a detective's eye, looking for clues to confirm or dispel my growing suspicions. The gaslighting started the next time he came home from Dallas. I'd been rehearsing what I wanted to say for days, trying to find the right words that wouldn't sound accusatory or paranoid. I practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusted my tone, softened my approach until I was barely asking anything at all. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple, and I finally worked up the courage. Richard, Linda mentioned she heard you've been staying at a hotel in Dallas pretty regularly. Is everything okay with the business? He didn't even look at me, just took a long drink of his beer and laughed, this dismissive sound that made me feel about 2 inches tall. Linda needs to mind her own damn business, and you need to stop listening to gossip. The casualness of his tone somehow made it worse than if he'd gotten angry. I've got clients all over the city. Sometimes meetings run late. You know how it is. He took another swig of beer, his eyes fixed on the horizon, effectively dismissing the conversation. But I didn't know how it was. Not anymore. The man sitting next to me felt like a stranger wearing Richard's face, and when I pressed just a little harder, asking why he hadn't mentioned it before, his eyes went cold in a way I'd never seen. Jesus, Maggie, are you seriously going to start acting paranoid at your age? I work my ass off to keep this place running, and this is the thanks I get. The words stung worse than a slap because they activated every insecurity I'd ever had about being too emotional, too needy, too much. I apologized. Can you believe that? I actually apologized for daring to ask a simple question about my own husband's whereabouts. That night I lay awake listening to him snore, feeling like I was losing my mind, wondering if I really was being paranoid and unreasonable like he said. The self-doubt was corrosive. I'd lie there in the dark, running through every interaction, questioning my own judgment, wondering if I was imagining things or overreacting to normal behavior. Richard's dismissiveness made me feel foolish for even having concerns. That's what gaslighting does. It makes you doubt your own perception of reality, makes you feel crazy for trusting your instincts. I started second-guessing everything, from my memory of conversations to my interpretation of his behavior. Was I being unreasonable? Was I turning into one of those suspicious, controlling wives? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing the truth would have been. Have you ever doubted your own sanity? Had someone you love make you feel crazy for trusting your instincts? It's a special kind of hell, that moment when you start to question your own perception of reality. For the next 2 weeks, I tried to be the perfect wife, as if being perfect enough would make everything okay again. I cooked his favorite meals, chicken fried steak with cream gravy, pecan pie from scratch, biscuits that melted in your mouth. I kept the house immaculate, made sure his clothes were pressed, didn't complain when he worked late or left early. I smiled when he left for Dallas and welcomed him home without questions. I became a ghost of myself, performing the role of devoted wife while dying inside. And the whole time, a part of me was dying inside, suffocating under the weight of all the things I wasn't allowed to say. I'd catch my reflection in windows and barely recognize myself. The woman staring back looked tired, defeated, smaller somehow. I stopped making plans with friends because I didn't trust myself not to break down and confess my fears. I avoided Linda's calls because I couldn't bear to hear the concern in her voice or answer her questions about how I was doing. I was drowning in my own home, in my own marriage, and I didn't know how to save myself. Then I found the receipt. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was sorting through the mail and the various papers that always seemed to accumulate on Richard's desk in the study. This wasn't snooping, not really. I'd always helped manage household paperwork, paid bills, filed documents. The receipt had been folded small and tucked inside a bank statement, and at first I almost threw it away without looking. But something made me unfold it, smooth it out against the desk's surface. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just dumb luck. But that small piece of paper changed everything. The Driscoll Hotel in Austin, not Dallas. 3 nights, 2 months ago, charged to our joint credit card. The dates coincided with a weekend Richard had told me he was in San Antonio at a cattle auction. I remembered that weekend clearly because I'd offered to go with him, and he'd said it would be boring, just business, nothing I'd enjoy. I'd stayed home and repainted the guest bedroom while he was supposedly looking at livestock. My hands started shaking so hard the paper rattled, and I had to sit down before my legs gave out. The room number was 412. The total included room service charges that suggested 2 people dining, 2 entrees, 2 desserts, a bottle of expensive wine. And there, at the bottom in small print, was a note that the guest had requested late checkout. I stared at those details until my vision blurred, each line of text a small knife cutting into what remained of my trust. The hotel was in Austin, 15 miles from where I'd been painting walls while my husband was with another woman. The proximity made it somehow worse, like he'd been flaunting his betrayal right under my nose. I sat at that desk for 3 hours, the receipt in front of me, my mind cycling through denial and anger and a grief so profound it felt physical. I thought about all the times Richard had told me he was in San Antonio or Dallas, all the business trips that took him away for days at a time. How many of them had been lies? How long had this been going on? The questions multiplied until I felt like I was drowning in them, gasping for air in a room that suddenly felt too small and too close. When Richard came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the kitchen with the receipt laid out on the table like evidence at a crime scene. I'd spent hours trying to come up with an innocent explanation. Any possible reason why he would lie about being in San Antonio when he was actually in Austin. I'd run through scenarios in my mind. Maybe it was a surprise for me. Maybe the auction had been moved. Maybe there was some logical explanation I wasn't seeing. But deep down, I knew. I'd known since Linda's nephew had mentioned seeing him at hotels, known since I'd smelled unfamiliar perfume, known since he'd started making me feel crazy for asking simple questions. He walked in, whistling, dropped his keys on the counter, and froze when he saw my face. I must have looked different, felt different, because his expression changed immediately from casual to wary. "What's this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, pointing at the receipt. My hand trembled as I held it out to him, and I hated myself for that trembling, for showing weakness when I needed to be strong. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. His face went from surprised to calculating to angry in the space of a heartbeat, and I saw him make a decision about how to handle this. "You're going through my things now? Jesus Christ, Maggie, you really have lost it." The accusation came before any explanation, before any attempt to justify or clarify. He went on the offensive immediately, and I watched it happen with a strange clarity, seeing the manipulation tactic for what it was, even as it landed like a punch to my gut. The gaslighting intensified to a level that left me breathless. He snatched the receipt off the table and crushed it in his fist, telling me I had no right to snoop through his private papers, that the hotel must have made a mistake with the billing, that he'd been in San Antonio like he said, and this was just proof of how paranoid and controlling I'd become. His voice rose with each accusation, filling the kitchen with anger that seemed designed to overwhelm my quiet certainty. When I tried to point out the specific dates and the room service charges for 2 people, he raised his voice for the first time in our marriage, shouting that I was making him feel like a prisoner in his own home, that after everything he'd done for me and this ranch, I had the nerve to accuse him of lying. "I've sacrificed 42 years for this place, for you, and you thank me by treating me like a criminal?" His face was red, a vein pulsing in his temple, and he slammed his hand on the counter hard enough to make the dishes rattle. "You sit here all day with your chickens and your horses while I'm out there in the real world making the money that keeps this place afloat, and you dare question me?" The words were designed to hurt, to make me feel small and ungrateful, and they worked. I felt myself shrinking, retreating into that familiar pattern of backing down to keep the peace. I thought the receipt was the smoking gun, but it turned out to be just the first thread in a tapestry of deception that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. Richard stormed out after that confrontation, peeling out of the driveway in his truck and not returning until after midnight. I heard him come in, heard him moving around downstairs, but I stayed in bed pretending to be asleep, my body rigid with tension and my mind racing through everything I knew and didn't know. That night, after he stormed out, I sat alone in the dark kitchen and cried until I had no tears left. But somewhere in the midst of that breakdown, something shifted. The woman who apologized for asking questions started to die, and someone harder, someone angrier, began to take her place. I dried my eyes, made myself a pot of coffee, and started thinking clearly for the first time in weeks. If Richard was lying about the hotel, what else was he lying about? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The old Maggie would have accepted his explanation, apologized for doubting him, tried harder to be the perfect wife. But the old Maggie was gone, and the new one was done being manipulated. I made a decision in that dark kitchen, with the taste of salt still on my lips and the coffee growing cold in front of me. I wasn't going to confront him again. I wasn't going to give him the chance to lie or gaslight or make me feel crazy. Instead, I was going to find out the truth on my own terms, gather evidence, and then decide what to do with it. The shift from victim to investigator felt empowering, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had been controlling me. The investigation phase began the next morning with a level of determination that surprised even me. I'd always been the kind of woman who avoided conflict, who smoothed things over and kept the peace at any cost. But betrayal has a way of burning off that kind of passivity, leaving behind something raw and fierce. I started with our phone records, accessed online through our shared account. Richard had never bothered to change the password or create separate access because he'd never imagined I'd think to check. That assumption of my ignorance was almost as insulting as the lies themselves. Page after page revealed calls to a single Dallas number, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, often late at night when Richard claimed to be in business meetings. The calls had been going on for over a year, long conversations lasting 30 minutes or more, late-night calls after I'd gone to bed. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a business contact or a casual friend. This was someone he spoke to more often than he spoke to me, someone who occupied his thoughts and his time in ways I no longer did. My heart hammered as I copied down the number, my handwriting getting shakier with each digit, but I forced myself to document everything methodically, creating a timeline of calls that told a story of sustained deception. I created a spreadsheet because that's how my mind works, organizing the data into patterns I could analyze. Calls before and after his trips to Dallas, calls late at night, calls that lasted an hour or more. The data painted a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. This wasn't a brief indiscretion or a moment of weakness. This was a sustained relationship that had been going on parallel to our marriage for over a year, maybe longer. Linda came over that afternoon with a bottle of wine and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that had gotten her through 2 divorces and the raising of 3 kids on her own. I'd called her that morning, my voice breaking as I asked if she could come by, and she'd shown up within the hour with supplies. wine, chocolate, tissues, and the fierce loyalty that had sustained our friendship for nearly 50 years. I showed her everything: the hotel receipt, the phone records, the way Richard had exploded when I questioned him. She didn't say "I told you so," which I appreciated more than I could express. Instead, she sat with me at the kitchen table, her weathered hand covering mine, and she let me cry until I was empty. "I knew something was wrong at the barbecue," she said quietly. "The way you laughed too loud at his jokes, the way you kept touching him like you were trying to convince yourself everything was fine. I've seen that before, Maggie. I've been that woman who knows but doesn't want to know." Her honesty broke something open in me, permission to stop pretending, to stop trying to be strong and perfect and fine. We sat there for a long time in silence, two old friends who'd seen each other through childhood and marriage and loss, and I felt less alone than I had in weeks. Then Linda pulled out her phone and made a call to her nephew, who worked in private investigation in San Antonio. "We're going to find out exactly what your husband has been up to," she said, her voice hard as flint. "And then you're going to decide what you want to do about it. But Maggie, honey, you need to know the truth. All of it. Because you can't make a decision about your life based on lies and half-truths." Her words gave me permission to do what part of me still felt was wrong, to investigate my own husband, to become the suspicious wife I'd always scorned. But another part of me, the part that was growing stronger by the hour, knew she was right. The PI's name was Marcus Chen, and he had the kind of quiet competence that made me feel like I was finally doing something right. We met at a coffee shop in Austin, neutral territory where Richard was unlikely to see us, and Marcus listened to my story with the patient attention of someone who'd heard variations of it many times before. He didn't judge or offer platitudes. He just took notes, asked clarifying questions, and outlined what he could and couldn't do legally. Within a week, he'd tracked the Dallas phone number to a woman named Claire Donovan, 47 years old, worked in commercial real estate. The photos he showed me made my stomach turn over. Richard and Claire having lunch at an upscale restaurant, his hand covering hers across the table. Richard and Claire entering a condo building in downtown Dallas, his arm around her waist in a gesture of casual intimacy. Richard and Claire looking at each other the way Richard used to look at me about 30 years ago, back when we were young and still believed in forever. The photos were time-stamped and dated, a visual timeline of betrayal that made denial impossible. I stared at them in Marcus's office, these glossy prints that documented my husband's double life, and I felt like I was looking at a stranger. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came when Marcus dug into the public records and found documents showing that Richard had been in consultation with Claire about the potential sale value of ranch properties in the Austin area, specifically properties matching the exact acreage and description of the Anderson Ranch. There were emails discussing market values, potential buyers, zoning changes that could increase the property's worth. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, treating my inheritance like a commodity to be liquidated for their benefit. I sat in Marcus's office staring at those documents, and I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching some other woman's life fall apart. "He's planning to sell the ranch," I said, and my voice sounded hollow and distant, like it was coming from very far away. The words didn't seem real, couldn't be real, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Marcus nodded, his expression sympathetic but professional. "It looks that way, Mrs. Anderson. The question is whether he legally can. You need to talk to a lawyer about the property deed and your rights." The metallic taste of shock filled my mouth, and I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from falling. This wasn't just about an affair, about Richard's fidelity or lack thereof. This was about my entire life, my family's legacy, the land my grandfather had worked himself to death to pay off during the Depression. This was about the trees my mother had planted, the fences I'd mended, the cattle I'd raised. Richard wasn't just betraying me as a husband. He was trying to steal my inheritance, my home, my future. He was trying to erase 3 generations of Anderson history for profit, to sell my birthright to developers who would tear down the barn and pave over the pastures and build strip malls where cattle had grazed for 100 years. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the kitchen table with every document Marcus had given me spread out in front of me, and I made plans. The old Maggie would have confronted Richard, would have cried and begged him to explain, would have given him a chance to talk his way out of it. But the old Maggie was gone, burned away in the heat of this betrayal. The new Maggie was going to be smart. The new Maggie was going to gather every piece of evidence, build an unassailable case, and make absolutely certain that Richard Anderson couldn't manipulate or gaslight or steal from her ever again. I thought about my grandfather, who'd held on to this land through dust bowls and droughts and economic depressions. I thought about my mother, who'd raised 4 children here while managing the ranch's books and cooking for hired hands. I thought about every Anderson who'd worked this soil, and I made them a promise in that dark kitchen. I would not let this land be stolen. Not by Richard, not by his mistress, not by anyone. A betrayal this deep doesn't heal. It scars over. And you either let it destroy you, or you let it make you harder than diamond. I chose hardness. I chose survival. I chose fight. The smoking gun arrived 2 weeks later in the form of audio recordings. Marcus had connections I didn't ask too many questions about, and he'd managed to obtain recordings of phone conversations between Richard and Claire. The legality was questionable, but Marcus assured me they could be used to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, even if they couldn't be used in court. I listened to them alone in my car, parked at the far end of our property where no one could see me cry, where no one could hear the sounds of my heart breaking. Richard's voice, so familiar it hurt, talking about how the ranch was worth millions if they could just get it rezoned for commercial development. "The location is perfect," he said, his tone businesslike and cold. 15 miles from Austin, easy highway access, enough acreage to develop a significant commercial complex. We're sitting on a gold mine, and Maggie has no idea. Claire's voice responded with details about potential buyers, about the profit margins that would make them both wealthy, about how they needed to handle the transfer of the deed carefully to avoid arousing suspicion. "You're sure she'll sign?" Claire asked, and I could hear the doubt in her voice. There was a pause, and then Richard laughed, this casual sound that cut deeper than any of his previous lies. "Maggie won't be a problem. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She always has." The confidence in his voice, the absolute certainty that I was too stupid or too trusting to question him, hit me like a physical blow. She spent 42 years doing exactly what I tell her to do. This won't be any different. I sat in my car and listened to my husband dismiss me as a non-entity, a rubber stamp for his plans, someone so thoroughly controlled that she would sign away her own birthright without question. The recording went on, discussing timing and strategy, how they'd wait until after the 42nd anniversary celebration to start pushing paperwork, how Richard would frame it as estate planning or tax benefits or some other explanation I wouldn't understand well enough to question. They had it all figured out, every detail of how to steal my life while making me complicit in my own destruction. The rage that filled me was cold and clarifying, like ice water in my veins. I stopped crying. I stopped feeling anything except a crystalline determination to make sure Richard paid for every lie, every manipulation, every moment he'd made me doubt my own reality. I drove home and looked at my ranch with new eyes, seeing it not as the place I'd lived for most of my life, but as the battlefield where I would fight for everything that mattered. The house stood solid and weathered against the Texas sky, and I made a silent promise to my grandfather, to my mother, to every Anderson who'd worked this land, that I would not let it be stolen. Not today, not ever. I called the lawyer Linda had recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Hartley, who specialized in property law and divorce cases. Her office was in downtown Austin, all glass and steel and expensive furniture that made me feel out of place in my ranch clothes and dusty boots. But Patricia herself was warm and direct, with gray hair cut short and eyes that saw everything. She listened to my story without interrupting, reviewed the documents Marcus had gathered, listened to portions of the recordings, and leaned back in her chair with a grim smile. Mrs. Anderson, the good news is that the ranch is in your name, inherited from your family. Richard has no legal right to sell it without your explicit consent. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I felt dizzy. The bad news is that he's clearly been planning to get that consent through deception or coercion, and based on these recordings, possibly fraud. She outlined my options with clinical precision: divorce with favorable settlement, criminal charges for attempted fraud, restraining orders, property protection. I absorbed every word like a student cramming for the most important test of her life, taking notes, asking questions, refusing to leave any detail uncovered. Patricia pulled out a thick folder and walked me through exactly what needed to happen. First, we secure the property legally. I'll file paperwork ensuring that no sale or transfer can occur without court approval. Second, we document everything: the affair, the financial planning with Claire, every instance of Richard attempting to manipulate you into signing documents. Third, we prepare for divorce proceedings and decide whether you want to pursue criminal fraud charges. She paused, studying my face. How far are you willing to go with this, Maggie? Because your husband has committed crimes here, and you have every right to prosecute them. I thought about that question, sitting in Patricia's expensive office with the Austin skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. How far was I willing to go? The old Maggie would have sought the path of least conflict, the quiet divorce with minimal public exposure. But the new Maggie, the one who'd been forged in the fire of betrayal, wanted justice, wanted consequences, wanted Richard to face the reality of what he'd tried to do. I want him to pay, I said quietly. Not just financially. I want everyone to know what he tried to do. I want there to be consequences that he can't manipulate or charm his way out of. Patricia smiled, and it was the smile of a warrior recognizing another fighter. Then let's build a case that's absolutely unassailable. By the time I left her office, I had a plan, a legal strategy, and a timeline. All I needed now was the courage to execute it. And courage, I was discovering, was something I had in abundance once I stopped trying to be nice and started trying to be strong. The masquerade began the next day, and it was harder than anything I'd ever done. I had to pretend everything was normal, had to smile at Richard over breakfast, and ask about his day, and act like I didn't know he was planning to steal my home and run off with his mistress. Every interaction felt like walking on broken glass, maintaining the facade of the dutiful wife while my insides screamed with rage and hurt. I cooked his favorite meals: pot roast with vegetables, biscuits with honey butter, peach cobbler that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon. I laughed at his jokes, terrible puns and stories I'd heard 100 times before. I asked polite questions about his trips to Dallas, and when he lied to my face, I nodded and smiled and died a little more inside. But all the while, I was gathering evidence, securing my legal position, and preparing for the confrontation that would end everything. Patricia worked with me to ensure every aspect of the property deed was ironclad, that there was no loophole Richard could exploit, no way for him to claim community property rights or force a sale. We documented every lie, every deception, every conversation with Claire that revealed the depth of his conspiracy. Marcus continued his surveillance, building a timeline that showed exactly how long the affair had been going on and how it correlated with Richard's increasing pressure for me to sign various financial documents. I'd refused those documents at the time without really understanding why, just following an instinct that something felt wrong. Now I understood that instinct had probably saved the ranch. Richard had brought home papers claiming they were for tax purposes or estate planning, documents with complicated legal language that he said I didn't need to worry about understanding. The old Maggie had started to sign a few times, trusting her husband to handle the business side of things. But something had always stopped her at the last moment, some small voice of caution that made her set down the pen and say she'd look at it more carefully later. Richard had been frustrated by those refusals, had pressured and cajoled, and even gotten angry a few times. Now I knew why. The close call came on a Tuesday evening when Richard came home unexpectedly early. I'd been in the study reviewing documents with Patricia via video call, and I barely had time to shut down the computer and hide the files before he walked through the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought he must be able to hear it, the physical manifestation of adrenaline and fear coursing through my body. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, taking in the scene with the suspicious attention of someone who sensed something wasn't quite right. My heart pounded so hard I thought he must be able to hear it, but I kept my voice steady, falling back on decades of practice at appearing calm when I was anything but. "Just paying some bills, checking the accounts." "Why?" I gestured at the computer screen, which thankfully showed our bank's website, a plausible cover for my actual activities. He shrugged, but I could see the suspicion in his face, the calculation happening behind his eyes as he tried to assess whether something had changed, whether I'd discovered anything I shouldn't have. "No reason. Just seems like you're spending a lot of time on the computer lately." He moved closer, and I forced myself not to flinch, not to show any sign of the terror racing through my veins. The files Patricia had sent me were in a folder on the desk, hidden under a ranch supply catalog, and I prayed he wouldn't notice them. I laughed, and it sounded almost natural, a skill I'd developed over the past weeks of constant performance. "Well, someone has to keep track of the finances around here, and you're always so busy with your business in Dallas." The moment hung there, balanced on a knife's edge, and I could see Richard deciding whether to push further or let it go. Finally, he nodded and left the study, and I waited until I heard his footsteps on the stairs before I allowed myself to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them together, and I realized how close I'd come to having everything exposed before I was ready. From that moment on, I was even more careful, conducting my calls with Patricia from my car or the barn, keeping all documents locked in a safe deposit box at the bank in town. That night I lay awake next to him, feeling the heat coming off his body and wondering how I'd ever trusted this man with my life. The psychological toll of the pretense was crushing, a constant weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I was living a double life, the obedient wife on the surface and the strategic fighter underneath, and the cognitive dissonance was exhausting. But every time I thought about giving up, about just confronting him and getting it over with, I remembered Patricia's advice. The element of surprise is your greatest advantage. Let him think he's winning. Let him get comfortable. And when the moment is right, we'll pull the rug out from under him so hard he'll never see it coming. So I held on, day after day, week after week, dying inside, but maintaining the mask. The strain showed in small ways I couldn't quite hide. I lost weight, my clothes hanging looser on a frame that had always been sturdy and solid. I stopped sleeping well, lying awake for hours listening to Richard breathe, while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios and contingency plans. Linda noticed, commenting on the dark circles under my eyes and the way my hands trembled when I held my coffee cup. But I couldn't tell her everything, couldn't risk any information leaking before I was ready. The isolation was its own kind of torture, carrying this enormous secret alone, except for Patricia and Marcus, who were professionals doing a job rather than friends offering support. I found solace in the ranch work, throwing myself into physical labor that left me too exhausted to think. I mended fences that didn't really need mending, reorganized the barn, spent hours grooming horses until their coats gleamed. The animals didn't judge or question or lie. They just accepted care and affection and gave it back in simple, honest ways. My favorite horse, an old mare named Sadie, who'd been on the ranch for 20 years, seemed to sense something was wrong. She'd nuzzle my shoulder while I brushed her, her warm breath on my neck, a comfort that brought tears I couldn't afford to shed anywhere else. I set the trap for our 42nd wedding anniversary, which fell on the last Saturday in August. I planned a celebration at the ranch, ostensibly to renew our vows and celebrate our decades together. The idea came to me one sleepless night, and I knew immediately it was perfect. The ultimate stage for Richard's exposure, a gathering of everyone who mattered to witness his fall from grace. I invited everyone who mattered, sent out beautiful printed invitations on cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering, hired caterers and a band. The preparations became my cover for all the other planning I was doing, the real strategic work of ensuring everything would unfold exactly as I needed it to. Richard was surprised but pleased, clearly seeing it as confirmation that I suspected nothing, that I was still the compliant wife he'd always known. He thought the party was evidence of my obliviousness, proof that his manipulation had worked and I remained firmly under his control. "This is really something, Maggie," he said when I showed him the invitation design. 42 years, who would have thought? He smiled at me, and I smiled back, and the whole exchange was a performance of a marriage that had died months ago, but neither of us had officially declared dead. He had no idea that every detail of the party was carefully orchestrated, from the guest list that included my lawyer and several key witnesses, to the timing that coincided with Marcus's final report, to the microphone system I'd arranged under the guise of giving speeches. I told Richard we'd have toasts, and I wanted to say a few words about our marriage, which he thought was sweet and sentimental, never imagining that those words would be his destruction. The party became a project that consumed my days, giving me a legitimate reason to make phone calls and have meetings and spend time away from Richard's watchful eyes. Linda helped me with the preparations, and sometimes she'd catch my eye and just shake her head in amazement. "Maggie Anderson, I never knew you had this in you," she said one afternoon as we were arranging tables in the yard, setting up a network of seating that would ensure everyone had a clear view of the microphone area. The August heat was brutal, but we worked through it, driven by purpose and the promise of justice. "I'm not sure I did either," I admitted, pausing to wipe sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. But it turns out, when someone tries to take everything from you, you discover exactly what you're capable of. It was true in ways I was still discovering. The woman I was becoming barely resembled the woman I'd been 6 months ago, and while part of me mourned that loss, another part celebrated the strength I'd found in the ruins of my marriage. The invitations went out, the RSVPs came back, and the anniversary celebration took shape like a beautiful, terrible machine designed for one purpose: the public exposure of Richard Anderson and everyone who'd helped him. I kept a detailed timeline, coordinating with Patricia and Marcus to ensure every element would fall into place. We had backup plans for the backup plans, contingencies for every possible way Richard might try to escape or deflect. By the time the day arrived, I felt as prepared as it was possible to be for the destruction of my own marriage. The morning of the party, I woke up feeling strangely calm. The terror and anxiety of the past months had crystallized into something hard and certain, and I moved through the day's preparations with methodical precision. The caterers arrived at noon, setting up long tables laden with food, brisket and ribs, potato salad and coleslaw, corn on the cob and baked beans, peach cobbler and pecan pie. The band set up their equipment on the small stage we'd built at the edge of the yard. I supervised everything, ensuring every detail was perfect because this needed to be flawless. I put on the new dress I'd bought for the occasion, navy blue with white trim, simple and elegant. I did my hair and makeup with more care than I'd taken in years, and when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. This woman looked strong, determined, ready for battle. When Richard saw me, he smiled and told me I looked beautiful, and I smiled back and thanked him, and the whole exchange felt like we were actors in a play, reading lines we'd memorized long ago. He had no idea this would be the last day of our marriage, the last time he'd ever set foot on Anderson land. "You've done an amazing job with all this," Richard said, gesturing at the yard that had been transformed into a party venue. "Really, Maggie, it looks perfect." He kissed my cheek, and I accepted the gesture without flinching, without giving any indication that his touch made my skin crawl. Just a few more hours, I told myself. Just hold on a little longer, and then it will all be over. The guests started arriving around 3 in the afternoon, and the ranch yard filled with people I'd known for decades. Friends and neighbors, Richard's business associates who I'd smiled at across countless dinner tables, his brother David and his family who'd driven up from Houston. David's wife Sandra hugged me and commented on how wonderful everything looked, and I thanked her while wondering if she'd known about Richard's plans, if she'd been complicit in the conspiracy to steal my home. I'd find out soon enough. The caterers had set up long tables laden with food, and the band played soft country music as people mingled and laughed. It was a perfect Texas afternoon, hot and bright, with a breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass and cattle. The sky was that brilliant blue you only get in late summer, and white clouds drifted lazily overhead. Children ran wild in the field beyond the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind, and for a moment I felt a pang of grief for what I was about to destroy. But then I remembered the recordings of Richard dismissing me as someone who would sign whatever he put in front of her, and my resolve hardened. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, hugging old friends, playing the role of the happy wife celebrating 4 decades of marriage. And all the while, the knowledge of what was coming hummed through me like electricity. People commented on the party, on the food, on how wonderful it was to see Richard and me still so happy together. Each comment was a small knife cutting into me, but I kept smiling, kept nodding, kept performing the role until the appointed time. Patricia arrived at 4, dressed professionally despite it being a weekend party, in a black pantsuit that marked her as someone official, someone with purpose. She positioned herself near the microphone system we'd set up, and I saw a few people glance at her with curiosity, wondering who she was. Marcus came separately, blending into the crowd with a camera around his neck like any other guest documenting the celebration. He'd positioned himself for optimal recording angles, ensuring that everything that happened would be captured in high-definition video and audio. Linda stayed close to me, a silent source of strength, her hand occasionally squeezing mine when no one was looking. She knew what was coming, though not all the details, and I could feel her nervous energy matching my own. "You ready for this?" she whispered at one point, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. Was I ready to blow up my life in front of 87 witnesses? Was I ready to make my private pain public? The answer was yes, because the alternative was letting Richard get away with it, and that was something the new Maggie would never accept. At 5 o'clock, exactly as we'd planned, I made my way to the microphone stand. Richard was near the bar, laughing with his brother about something, completely at ease. He looked happy, relaxed, like a man without a care in the world. He thought he'd won. He thought the naive, trusting Maggie would never suspect, never investigate, never fight back. He'd spent our entire marriage training me to be compliant, and he believed that training was unbreakable. He was about to discover how wrong he'd been. I tapped the microphone, and the feedback squeal cut through the conversation, bringing silence to the yard. 87 people turned to look at me, and I felt their attention like a physical force. The weight of all those eyes could have crushed me, should have crushed the old Maggie, but the new one stood tall and felt powerful. "Thank you all for coming," I began, and my voice carried across the ranch with clarity that surprised me. "I wanted to gather everyone here today to celebrate something important, but it's not exactly what the invitation said." I paused, watching the confusion ripple through the crowd, and then I continued. "Over the past months, I've learned some difficult truths about my marriage, and I think it's time to share them with all of you." I could see Richard's face change, the color draining like water from a basin, his smile freezing into something rigid and false. David looked confused, his head swiveling between me and his brother. The crowd shifted, sensing drama, that electric anticipation of a scene about to unfold. 3 months ago, I found a hotel receipt that proved my husband had lied about his whereabouts, I continued, and the silence deepened until you could have heard a pin drop in the grass. That discovery led me to hire a private investigator, and what we found was more than just an affair. We found evidence of a systematic plan to steal this ranch, my family's ranch, and sell it for commercial development. The words landed like bombs, and I saw the shock ripple through the crowd. Gasps and murmurs started, people turning to their neighbors with wide eyes. I nodded to Marcus, who began projecting images on the screen we'd set up, ostensibly for showing old wedding photos. Instead, the photos showed Richard and Claire together, having lunch, entering hotels, looking at each other with intimate familiarity. Then came the documents. Property valuations, sales projections, emails discussing how to handle the Maggie problem. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs, and I raised my voice over the noise. For over a year, my husband has been working with his mistress, a commercial real estate agent named Claire Donovan, to defraud me of my inheritance. I let that sink in, watching the faces in the crowd shift from shock to anger to disgust. People who'd known Richard for decades were seeing him clearly for the first time, and the revelation was written across their faces in real time. Richard tried to move toward me, his face twisted with rage and panic, but David grabbed his arm, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what was happening. The younger brother who'd always looked up to Richard was now physically restraining him, and the role reversal was almost poetic. "That's a lie," Richard shouted, but his voice cracked, and everyone could hear the desperation in it. "Maggie's been acting crazy, paranoid, she's making all this up." But the evidence was there on the screen for everyone to see, and I'd made sure to include the most damning elements. The audio transcripts of Richard dismissing me as someone who'd sign whatever I put in front of her, the property valuations highlighting the ranch's multi-million-dollar potential, the discussions with potential buyers about tearing down the historic structures and developing commercial complexes. The faces in the crowd shifted from shock to anger, and I could see people I'd known for years looking at Richard with disgust and disappointment. Several business associates had already started edging toward the exit, wanting to distance themselves from this disaster. "You thought you could sell my legacy for profit, but today I reclaim my worth." The words came out of me with a force that surprised everyone, including myself, and I saw Richard actually step back like I'd struck him physically. My voice rang across the yard, strong and clear and absolutely certain. "This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, I said, and now there were tears on my face, but my voice never wavered. "My grandfather built the main house with his own hands during the Depression, working dawn to dusk for years to pay off the mortgage. My mother planted every tree in that grove over there, choosing each variety carefully and nurturing them through droughts. I have fed cattle on this land, mended fences until my hands bled, weathered droughts and floods and recessions." I took a breath, looking directly at Richard, whose face had gone from red to pale, from angry to something approaching terror. "And you thought you could take it from me with lies and manipulation because I was too stupid or too trusting to notice. You underestimated me, Richard. You thought 42 years of conditioning had broken something essential in me, but all it did was bury it. And when you threatened the thing I love most, that buried strength came roaring back to life." The crowd was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word, and I could see phones out recording everything, capturing this moment that would be replayed and discussed for years to come in every corner of the county and beyond. I'd made sure several local reporters were on the guest list, and I could see them frantically taking notes, recognizing the story of a lifetime unfolding in front of them. I was naive, but now I'm unstoppable. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, and Patricia stepped forward with a folder full of legal documents, her presence adding official weight to my words. "I'm filing for divorce. The ranch will remain entirely in my name, as it legally has been all along. Richard will leave this property today and will not return. Any attempt to contest this will result in criminal charges for fraud and attempted theft." I let that threat hang in the air, watching Richard process the full implications of what he was facing. And Claire Donovan, if you're watching this when it goes viral online, because I guarantee you it will, you just destroyed the life of a man who was planning to leave you the second the sale went through. Congratulations. The savage satisfaction I felt delivering those lines was better than any revenge fantasy I'd ever indulged in. This was public humiliation on a scale Richard had never imagined, and the best part was that every word I'd said was absolutely true. Claire had thought she was getting a wealthy rancher ready to start a new life with her, but the reality was she'd been a tool in Richard's plan to cash out and disappear. The fall came swiftly and completely. Richard's business associates melted away from him like he was radioactive, and I watched his brother David's face shift from confusion to fury as he realized the full scope of the betrayal. "You were going to sell Maggie's ranch?" David said, his voice low and dangerous, still gripping Richard's arm. "After everything she's done for this family, after 42 years of marriage, you were going to steal her inheritance and run off with some woman in Dallas?" The betrayal of family, of blood, added another layer to Richard's crimes, and I could see David wrestling with the realization that his brother was not the man he'd thought him to be. Richard tried to bluster, to explain, to shift blame onto me, onto Claire, onto anyone but himself. "It's not what it looks like, David. Maggie's twisting everything. The ranch needs to be sold. It's not profitable anymore. I was doing what was best for both of us. But there was no recovering from this. The evidence was too complete. The public exposure too total. He'd been caught in a lie so enormous that no amount of gaslighting could make it go away. His words fell on deaf ears, and I saw the moment he realized it, the deflation as his shoulders slumped and his protestations stopped. People started leaving then, the party breaking up like clouds after a storm. Some stopped to hug me, to whisper words of support and shock at what Richard had done. Others simply wanted to escape the awkwardness, to go home and process what they'd witnessed. I stood my ground on the porch, watching the crowd disperse, feeling strangely empty now that the confrontation was over. Linda stayed beside me, her arm around my waist, and Patricia was on my other side, a professional barrier between me and any attempt Richard might make to approach. The sheriff's deputy I'd hired as security for the party escorted Richard to his truck, making sure he left without incident. I watched him drive away, and I felt nothing but a bone-deep relief that it was finally over. The performance was done. The mask could come off. I could finally stop pretending and start healing. Within a week, the consequences cascaded like dominoes falling in a line. Richard's business partners discovered other financial irregularities and forced him out of the company he'd helped build. Apparently, I wasn't the only one he'd been deceiving. There were questions about expense reports and client funds that suddenly needed answers. Claire Donovan's real estate firm, wanting to avoid any association with fraud, terminated her employment. The story spread through Austin and beyond, picked up by local news and then social media, becoming one of those viral tales of betrayal and comeuppance that people share with comments like, "Good for her," and "This is why you don't mess with Texas women." The attention was overwhelming at first. Reporters called wanting interviews, and my story appeared in newspapers from Houston to Dallas. Someone created a hashtag, "You Maggie Anderson, I's a badass." And suddenly, I had people messaging me from all over the country, sharing their own stories of betrayal and survival. It was humbling and empowering all at once, this realization that my private pain had struck a chord with so many others. I did a few interviews, carefully managed by Patricia, telling my story in the hope it might help someone else find the courage to fight back. Richard's attempts to salvage his reputation failed spectacularly, each explanation sounding more desperate than the last. He tried claiming I'd misunderstood his intentions, that he'd only been exploring options for our retirement, that Claire was just a business associate. But the recordings and documents told a different story, one that couldn't be explained away or reframed. Finally, he stopped trying and retreated into bitter silence, hiring a lawyer who advised him to settle quickly and avoid criminal prosecution. He tried one last manipulation, showing up at the ranch 3 weeks after the party with tears in his eyes and apologies on his lips. I met him at the property line with Patricia and a sheriff's deputy, and I let him speak his piece about how sorry he was, how he'd made a terrible mistake, how we could work through this if I just gave him another chance. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the exposure had literally shrunk him. His hair looked grayer, his face more lined, and part of me felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the old instinct to comfort and forgive. But then I remembered his voice on those recordings, dismissing me as someone who would sign whatever he put in front of her, and that flicker died. The old Maggie might have wavered, might have felt guilty for destroying his life, might have wondered if she was being too harsh. But that woman was dead and buried, and the new Maggie looked at him with eyes as cold as January frost. "You underestimated the strength of a woman who has nothing left to lose," I said quietly. "And that was your biggest mistake. Now get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." I watched him drive away for the last time, and I felt nothing but relief and a bone-deep certainty that I'd done the right thing. His family, who had initially tried to defend him, gradually came to understand the full depth of his betrayal and the legal nightmare he'd nearly created for all of them. David came to see me privately and apologized for not believing me immediately, for not seeing the signs that his brother had become someone capable of such cruelty. We sat on the porch drinking sweet tea, and he told me stories about the Richard he remembered from childhood, trying to reconcile that person with the man who'd tried to steal from family. I accepted the apology because I understood the shock of discovering that someone you love isn't who you thought they were. That understanding was something I'd earned the hard way. "We see what we want to see," I told David, "especially with people we're supposed to trust." Richard counted on that, used it against both of us, but now we know, and knowing is the first step to making sure it never happens again. The legal proceedings were anticlimactic after the drama of the party. Patricia had built such a strong case that Richard's lawyer advised him to settle quickly and quietly. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the anniversary celebration, and I kept everything: the ranch, my dignity, my future. Richard got his clothes, his car, and the wreckage of a reputation he'd destroyed through his own greed and deception. The settlement included a non-disclosure agreement I refused to sign, wanting the freedom to tell my story if I chose, and Richard was in no position to negotiate. The last I heard, he'd moved to somewhere in New Mexico, trying to rebuild a life far away from the scene of his greatest failure. I didn't wish him ill, but I didn't wish him well either. I simply wished him gone, erased from my daily life like a mistake corrected. Sometimes I wondered if he'd learned anything, if the consequences had sparked any genuine self-reflection, but mostly I didn't think about him at all. That indifference was the greatest victory, the clearest sign that I'd healed. The aftermath brought an unexpected peace. I'd spent so much time and energy on the investigation and the planning that I hadn't really thought about what would come after. The ranch felt different without Richard in it, bigger somehow, more truly mine. Every room became a space I could reshape. Every decision became mine alone to make. I threw myself into the work of running it properly, learning aspects of the business I'd always delegated to him, discovering I was far more capable than I'd given myself credit for. I hired an accountant who walked me through the financial side, explaining investments and tax strategies in plain language without condescension. I took courses on ranch management and modern cattle practices. I joined organizations and networks of other ranch owners, mostly women like myself, who'd taken over family properties and were determined to succeed. Linda helped me hire a good foreman named Miguel who had 30 years of experience and didn't mind taking direction from a woman. Together, we implemented some improvements I'd been thinking about for years but never had the confidence to pursue: rotational grazing, a new water system, repairs to the barn that had been delayed too long. The place thrived in ways it hadn't in years, and I thrived with it. The cattle were healthier, the pastures greener, the whole operation running more efficiently than it ever had under Richard's management. It turned out that actually caring about the land, rather than seeing it as a commodity to be liquidated, made a substantial difference in outcomes. The ranch that Richard had viewed as a retirement fund was revealed to be a living, vital business when properly managed. The legal victory was complete. But more important was the personal transformation. I'd discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, a core of steel that had been there all along, buried under decades of conditioning to be agreeable and compliant. The woman who stood up in front of 87 people and destroyed her husband's reputation wasn't someone I'd known existed inside me. But now that I'd met her, I found I liked her much better than the old Maggie. She didn't apologize for taking up space. She didn't doubt her own perceptions. She didn't accept gaslighting or manipulation or lies. She was finally fully herself, unfiltered and unapologetic. Let me share something important I learned through this whole nightmare, because entertainment aside, there are real lessons here that might help someone listening. Financial abuse and coercive control often start small and build gradually over years. Richard didn't suddenly become a liar and a thief. He'd been conditioning me for decades to defer to his judgment, to accept his version of reality over my own observations, to feel guilty for questioning him. Those patterns made it possible for him to escalate to outright fraud because he'd trained me not to look too closely at what he was doing. If you're in a relationship where you constantly doubt your own perceptions, where you apologize for having normal concerns, where your partner gets angry or defensive when asked reasonable questions, those are red flags you shouldn't ignore. Trust your instincts. That voice in your head that says something is wrong, it's usually right. We talk ourselves out of believing it because we want to preserve the relationship, because we've been taught that good partners trust without question, because challenging someone we love feels like betrayal. But the real betrayal is someone using that trust to manipulate and control you. The signs were there all along if I'd known to look for them. The way Richard dismissed my feelings as overly emotional. The way he controlled access to financial information under the guise of handling the business side. The way he made me feel stupid for not understanding things he deliberately kept complicated and opaque. None of those things alone constituted abuse. But together, they created an environment where I couldn't effectively advocate for myself or protect my interests. And that's exactly what financial abusers count on. The erosion of your confidence and autonomy over time until you can't imagine standing up for yourself. If you're listening to this and recognizing patterns from your own life, please understand that trusting your instincts isn't paranoid or crazy. If something feels wrong, investigate it. You have every right to know what's happening with your own finances, your own property, your own life. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for asking questions or seeking clarity. Don't accept gaslighting that frames reasonable concerns as irrational suspicion. And if you discover betrayal, know that you're stronger than you think, more capable than anyone has given you credit for, and absolutely deserving of fighting for what's yours. Document everything. That's crucial advice I want to emphasize. If you suspect financial abuse or deception, start documenting immediately. Take photos of documents, record conversations if your state allows it. Keep a journal of incidents with dates and details. Build your case quietly and thoroughly before confronting anyone, because the element of surprise is your greatest advantage. Get professional help, a lawyer, a financial advisor, a therapist who understands abuse dynamics. Don't try to handle it alone. Because abusers are skilled at manipulation, and you need people on your side who can see clearly when you're too close to the situation. It's been 6 months now since the anniversary party, and I'm sitting on my porch watching the sun set over land that belongs fully and completely to me. The ranch is in my name, the debts are paid, and the future stretches out full of possibility instead of dread. I've started seeing someone, a kind widower from church named Thomas, who treats me with respect and actually listens when I talk. He's patient with my wariness, understanding that trust is something I'll rebuild slowly. While I'm in no hurry to remarry, it's nice to remember what healthy affection feels like. What it's like to be with someone who values my opinions and respects my boundaries. Linda comes over most evenings, and we drink wine and laugh about how far we've come since we were 17 and thought we knew everything about life and love. We sit on this same porch where I confronted Richard's betrayal, and we reclaim that space with friendship and hope. Sometimes we don't talk at all. Just sit in comfortable silence watching the stars come out, and that's enough. She's been my rock through all of this, and I'm grateful beyond words for her steadfast loyalty. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the public nature of the confrontation, if I wish I'd handled it more privately. The answer is no, not for a second. Richard spent years making me feel small and crazy in private, and he deserved to face the consequences of his actions in public. The exposure wasn't about revenge, though I won't lie and say there wasn't satisfaction in it. It was about creating accountability, about making sure there was no way for him to spin the narrative or gaslight his way out of what he'd done. It was about reclaiming my voice after decades of having it dismissed and diminished. Public exposure also served another purpose. It warned others. Women in the community reached out to tell me their own stories of financial abuse and control, some of them involving Richard's business practices. The public nature of my confrontation gave them courage to come forward, to demand accountability, to stop accepting treatment they'd normalized. In that way, my pain served a larger purpose, and that gives it meaning beyond my personal story. The ranch is thriving now in ways I never imagined possible. We've diversified into agritourism, hosting small events and offering horseback riding lessons to kids from Austin. The income from those ventures has made us more financially stable than we were even during the best years with Richard. I've discovered I have a head for business when I'm allowed to use it, and the confidence I've gained has spilled over into every area of my life. I speak up at town meetings now, serve on the local historical preservation board, mentor younger women going through divorces. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me ended up being the catalyst for becoming the person I was always meant to be. Some days I walk the property line and feel my grandfather's presence, sense my mother's approval. I like to think they're proud of me for fighting for what they built, for refusing to let it be stolen. The land has been in my family for 3 generations, and if I have my way, it will be here for 3 more. I'm working with a land conservancy to ensure it can never be developed, that the pastures and trees and history will be preserved no matter what happens. That's my legacy now, not just keeping the ranch, but protecting it for the future. So now I have a question for you, wherever you're listening to this story. What time is it where you are, and what city are you calling home today? Drop a comment and let me know. Because I love thinking about all the different places this story might travel, all the different people who might need to hear it. And if you connected with what I went through, if something in my story resonated with your own experience or gave you courage to face your own situation, hit that like button. Let me know I'm not alone in this, that my pain and my victory matter to someone out there in the digital universe. I'd also love to hear what you would have done in my position. Would you have confronted Richard privately or gone for the public exposure? Would you have tried to work things out or burned it all down the way I did? There's no wrong answer here. Every situation is different. Every person has to make choices based on their own values and circumstances. But I find the comments section is often full of wisdom and perspective I hadn't considered. And I learn as much from you as you might learn from me. So share your thoughts, your stories, your advice for others who might be going through something similar. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you hope or validation or just an entertaining hour of drama, please subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting to be told, more experiences worth sharing, more lessons learned the hard way that might help someone else avoid the same mistakes. And while you're here, check out the 2 videos on your screen. One about a woman who discovered her husband's secret family, and another about reclaiming your identity after financial abuse. Both stories feature strong women who refuse to be victims, and I think you'll find them just as compelling as this one. Until the next story, I want you to remember something important. You are stronger than anyone who's tried to diminish you, smarter than anyone who's tried to manipulate you, and more valuable than anyone who's failed to appreciate you. Trust your instincts, fight for what's yours, and never, ever let someone make you feel crazy for knowing the truth. Take care of your heart, protect your peace, and know that somewhere in Texas, a 64-year-old woman is sitting on her porch, master of her own domain, living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.